In this section on applications and software, we've covered a lot of different topics. What we do when we update these videos is we provide videos like this where we go through and we add any new and extra information and content to this course. So what we're going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be going over some newer content for the exam for the Tech Plus. I'm going to be giving you some different exam tips, just like we've done in previous sections, and I'll be going over practice questions. The one thing that I wanted to mention for this specific video, again, we do have extra information, so I do advise that you take notes in some of your existing physical notes if you've been taking physical notes, or if you've been taking, say, notes on a Google Doc or a Word or text pad, whatever it is, make sure that you take some more notes and that you update some of your sections, because the Tech Plus exam changes and it gets updated frequently with new topics and different learning areas and things like that. And while the overall picture of what we've learned in this section is still accurate, there's a few things that we do need to add. So let's jump into those first, then we'll go into some exam tips for this section, and then we'll go into some practice questions. First, let's talk about mobile device and server operating systems. We talked a little bit about devices and operating systems for laptops and computers, but for the current Tech Plus, you do need to know about mobile device operating systems and server operating systems. So iOS runs on Apple devices, mainly iPhones and Apple tablets. Android operating system, or Android OS, runs specifically on Android devices. There are different types of Android OS, though, depending on your specific tablet or your specific smartphone. Keep in mind, Android OS is kind of a generic term because, again, there can be multiple versions of Android as an operating system. Internet of Things devices usually use some sort of embedded operating system. You don't really need to know that in depth. Just understand these three different types of mobile devices or Internet of Things devices. They all have their own different type of operating system. Additionally, for servers, if we're in a corporate environment or a business environment, odds are we need to host some sort of server. Usually servers either run Windows Server or some variation of Linux specifically. These are by far the two most common operating systems specifically for servers. Next, let's go into file systems. So our file systems focus on managing our files and where and how data is stored. We've already talked about this quite a bit, but just keep in mind that file systems and files in general can have different features. These are newer, not newer features in general, but newer features that I've seen more commonly and students have mentioned that they've seen on the Tech Plus exam. So files can have encryption. Essentially, encryption is any sort of security that protects files from someone who shouldn't have access. The way they work is they encrypt the file with some sort of code or program, where if you don't have what's known as an encryption key, then you can't read the actual files. So that protects people who shouldn't have access, who accidentally get a hold of the file, from actually being able to access that file. Same thing with access rights and permissions. We talked about those a little bit, but access rights, permissions, roles, whatever you call them, wherever you're using them, even outside of files, those just control access to the files and data that those specific access rights, permissions, or roles are assigned to. So for example, if I have this folder called invoices here, I could add access rights to that folder, and then anything in that folder or beneath that folder now requires access rights to actually view. So for example, I might give someone read only to invoices, and then all they could do is open files. They could not modify files. Keep this in mind. This isn't a huge thing because you've likely encountered permissions. Even Google Drive and Google Docs and even a lot of online cloud storage platforms use these access rights, and you've likely encountered them sometime in either your career or your personal life. Compression is another part of files. So when we have really, really big files and we need to compress them, all compression is it's just a feature where we can reduce the file size, make it easier to upload things, reduce the file size, and it also makes it easier to download things. So essentially, think about it like you have a 1 gigabyte file, you might compress it, and you might be able to get it down to 4 or 5 or 600 megabytes, which is a decent compression. One note here that I wanted to cover is that files can be seen from a command line interface by using commands. What that would look like is this here. So what this person did was they put in an ls command, which is essentially listing out the current directory. And then from there, you can see it listed out a bunch of different files, folders, and things like that. In this case, this person ran this ls or list command on a Linux command line interface, but you could also use ls on, say, a Windows operating system by opening up command prompt. So just keep in mind, you don't need to know these commands. Just understand that you can still see files from a command line interface view. You don't necessarily have to only be using the GUI or graphic interface. Now let's go into software types. So we talked all about system software, productivity software earlier in this section, but there are a few extra categories of productivity software that you may see on the Tech Plus. First, you might see visual diagramming software. This is just creating a visual diagram. These are relatively simple, nothing too crazy here. Presentation software, super, super simple as well. Think PowerPoint or think Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides. Word processors are also pretty simple, something like Google Docs or Word, and then spreadsheets would be something like Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets. Next up is browsers, and there's two other browser features that you should be aware of in addition to what we've already talked about. So first is bookmarks. You can save websites, links here for easy access. And then the second one is accessibility or accessibility settings. These are essentially any settings or features that help those who have accessibility needs, such as someone who needs text to speech. For example, someone has visual impairments, they might not be able to actually read something on a screen, so they might need text to speech to actually navigate things. Next up is artificial intelligence, also known as AI. We covered this quite a bit. Some concepts that we didn't cover in depth in the AI video that you need to know for the exam are machine learning, deep learning, and LLMs. So these concepts here include machine learning. Machine learning allows systems or artificial intelligence to learn patterns from data and then make predictions or decisions preemptively based off of that data. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning that specifically processes more complex data like images, audio, language, things of that nature. This is what deep learning is. It's learning about very intricate subjects. LLMs, or large language models, these are pretty complex. These are AI models that are trained on massive amounts of data, specifically text, to be able to understand, generate, and have a wide variety of knowledge. So essentially, LLMs take millions of pieces of data, of text, whatever it is, whatever it's being trained on. And then from there, the large language model uses that information to do something, whether it's to understand the subject matter that it was learning from, whether it's to start to generate certain types of replies like ChatGPT, or whether it was just to build a wealth or a collection of information or knowledge. So LLMs are one of the newer side of things as it relates to us understanding them. And LLMs aren't really well known. We know that large language models, they learn from tons of data, but we don't actually really in-depth know exactly how they work. It's kind of strange, and not to go too complex or too deep in on this one, but LLMs are things like ChatGPT. Essentially has a ton of data and information because it's went out and it's analyzed millions or billions of pieces of information. Next up is licensing models, and here are some different licensing things that you do need to know. So when we initially talked about licensing, we covered it from a very broad perspective. All that information that we covered still applies, but you should understand these pieces of information for the current exam as well. So understand one-time purchase versus subscription. One-time purchase, all you have to do for a piece of software for access or for a license or a seat is just pay one time and then you get it for life. Subscription is more of a consistent basis. So you're paying monthly, quarterly, every 6 months, every year, every 2 years, every 3 years. You're on a subscription basis. So they're getting you to pay continuously for as long as you need the actual software. This is by far the most common model nowadays is subscription. It used to be one-time purchase was really common, not really that much nowadays. In terms of defining licenses and seats, licenses, they're essentially just giving access to the paid software for whatever you're purchasing. So your license, it's very similar to a seat. There's really not too much of a difference that you need to know about. Licenses and seats do almost the same thing nowadays. In fact, many times we just call it having a subscription. We don't really talk about the differences between licenses and seats, and you really don't need to know that. Just understand that when you purchase something, you're getting either a license or a seat, and that gives you access, and that just kind of verifies, okay, they paid for it, they have access to it for however long. Mostly providers automatically assign licensing and seats after a purchase, so you usually don't have to worry about them too much. Now, sometimes you do have to manually provision licenses or manually provision seats if you're in IT or you're in cybersecurity or something like that, but it's not really that important for the exam. Single user licenses, this is important. Single user licenses covers one person and that's it. One person has access to the software or one machine or device, and that's it. If you need it anywhere else, you got to pay for another license. Group use or site use licenses, this is for a wide group, a big group. This is multiple licenses. Concurrent licenses are pretty unique. This is one of the harder concepts to understand, but essentially when someone's using a software, they're using a license, and when they're not using it, they're not using a license. This is kind of a hard concept again, but essentially think of it like if someone's not actively using it, they're not taking up a license. Usually you don't see these this often. You usually see single user or group use or site use licenses. Next up is the exam tips. So operating system versus application. If a question on the exam asks what controls something, that's likely an operating system. If a question asks what a user uses, that's more than likely application, software, some sort of tool. Anything mentioning booting, memory, application, CPU usage, drivers, things like that, usually that's not application. Usually that's operating system. Next up is drivers versus applications. If hardware shows up but it doesn't work, that's usually a driver problem. If a program crashes but the system actually works, that's usually an application problem. So keep that in mind. If hardware isn't, let's say you have a printer, the printer's not working, might be a driver problem. All right, so keep that in mind. You might need a driver, and we've talked about drivers quite a bit already. And for CompTIA usually doesn't blame apps for hardware failures, so keep that in mind. For kernel is never optional and it's never user facing, so users aren't going to really be able to mess with the kernel. If a system can't start or crashes early, it could be a kernel or an operating system at large issue. If an operating system runs, but a feature fails, some sort of feature, it's not likely to be the kernel. GUI versus CLI. CLI answers are correct when the question mentions something automation, repeating tasks, speed, troubleshooting, any sort of command as well. GUI or GUIs are correct when a question mentions ease of use, new users, anything visual navigation, being able to see something, or from new users. Again, we've covered CLI or command line interface as well as GUIs or graphic user interface quite in depth. These are just recaps on what to look out for on the actual exam. Next up is files. If a wrong application or software opens a file, it's likely to be an extension issue with that file. If you can't edit a file, you might have read-only attributes, permissions, roles, or rights. File missing means that the file got deleted or it has a hidden attribute. Usually you won't see this on the exam that much, but if you do, the file either has the hidden attribute or it's been deleted. Folder path mentioned, usually that's a file system topic. Let's go into software categories now. If something creates content, it might be a piece of productivity software or it might be generative AI. If something protects or maintains, it's likely a utility. Remember, our antivirus, our different types of system file checks, those are utility software. If something enables teamwork, something like Zoom, Microsoft Teams, things like that, it's a collaboration software. If something has to exist for the computer to run, that's system software. Next up is licensing. Free does not mean modifiable. Free just means that you can use it for free. Only open source allows code changes. If licensing or cost is mentioned, ignore functionality or don't focus on functionality as much and pick license logic, because if they're talking about licensing or cost, they're mostly going to be focusing on the licensing model side of things. Next up is browsers. Incognito, remember, it only stops local storage. Websites can still get your IP address. They can still get more information and things like that. Our cache speeds sites up if we have the cache enabled. Remember, it keeps websites kind of like in our archives almost. So next time we visit them, it's a lot quicker. Clearing your cache is going to slow your first load, but it can sometimes solve issues. Browser loading slow after installations, it might be an extension problem. You might have installed the wrong extension or one that's not that compatible or it's not working well, so you can troubleshoot with that. Networking, anything about growth, control, security. We're talking about client server connections, anything about small or something being simple peer-to-peer connections. Artificial intelligence. CompTIA tests recognition. It doesn't focus on in-depth ethics questions or anything from a very high-level perspective that you need to know super in-depth. If content is created, remember that's generative AI. Remember, this is a little bit confusing, but let's go back up here, because remember, if something creates content for you, that's generative AI. If something enables you to create content, usually that's a piece of productivity software. Just keep in mind, if something is automatically created, it's normally going to be generative AI. If a task repeats automatically or something is set up to repeat automatically, that's automation. Next up, let's go into our practice questions. We have 6 for this section. I'm going to go through them rather quickly. If you remember from the last videos, what we're going to do is I'm going to have you pause the video, write down your answers for these 3, and then we're going to go on, review these 3, and then go to the next 3. So go ahead and pause the video now and write down your answers for 1, 2, and 3. Now let's go into the answers for these practice questions. Number 1, which component of an operating system directly manages CPU and memory usage? That is our kernel. That is a part of the operating system, and it helps manage both the CPU and our RAM or our memory. Question number 2, a printer stops working after moving to another workstation. What is the most likely cause? So a printer stops working. So it was working before, but it's no longer working once we move it to another computer or another workstation. That's more than likely B, missing driver. Now, if it said that the computer could not power on, that might be something like a power cable issue or something like that. But if it's not printing or the computer's not detecting it, it's likely a missing driver. Number 3, which interface is best suited for more advanced views of system files as well as for troubleshooting? That is C, command line interface. The command line interface allows us to put in different types of prompts or commands and then get information out of it, and it shows more advanced views and it's useful for troubleshooting. Here's question 4, 5, and 6. Go ahead and pause the video now and write down your answers to each question. Now let's go into each question's answers. Number 4, what does a file extension primarily show? A file extension primarily shows what program runs that file and its file type. Question number 5, which AI or which artificial intelligence technology creates new content such as text or images from prompts? That is D. That's our generative artificial intelligence or generative AI. Question number 6, which license type allows users to view and to modify source code? That is going to be C, open source. Remember, open source is the only type of licensing or the only type of software model that actually allows us to modify and view the source code. Commercial software does not, freeware does not, Trialware does not as well. Freeware does allow us to use the software for free, but open source is the only one that allows us to both view and to modify the code. Freeware, commercial, trialware, they don't even let us view the code, let alone modify it. So in this section, we covered all about software and applications. In the next section, we're going to be getting into data as well as databases. I'll see you over in the next section.